Я думаю, товарищи, что выражу мнение всех здесь присутствующих и мнение всего пролетариата нашей страны, если скажу, что нужно этих гадов расстрелять.
Никакой пощады врага! Расстрелять всех до одного, как бешеных собак! Смерть изменникам Родины!
The gulags, as the Soviet forced labor camps were called, were an infamous aspect of Joseph Stalin's regime. From the beginning of their implementation in 1930 until their disuse in the late 1950s, millions of people were sent to these terrible places. They could be found throughout the nation, in the brutal deserts of Central Asia, as well as in Arctic Siberia. Regardless of their location, the treatment the prisoners received was just as cruel. Subjected to endless days of work, fed on crumbs always ill-prepared for the climate, and constantly subjected to abuse by their captors, more than 1 million would die. But these camps were not intended solely for men. There were a number of them reserved for women, whom Stalin and his followers had branded as traitors. For some of them, the injustice was even worse. Their only crime was being related to political enemies of the Communist Party. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Alir, the most brutal concentration camp for women in the Soviet Union. By the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin had been the highest authority in the Soviet Union for several years. Still, his power was not total. Many well-known figures within the country did not have much confidence in his leadership. There were even plans to assassinate the General Secretary, which were never carried out. Stalin, paranoid by nature, decided to strike his enemies first. With the help of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which also functioned as a secret police, a huge number of members of the Communist Party began to be investigated. Anyone suspected of treasonous intentions was removed from office. But not only that. If they were lucky, they could be imprisoned in the gulags, that is, in forced labor camps. If not, their fate was death. Hundreds of thousands of people fell victim to the Great Purge, as the campaign came to be known. Government employees, political party leaders, and high-ranking Red Army officers were just some of the victims. But ordinary citizens were not spared either. Thousands were accused of being saboteurs or spies, and suffered the same fate as state personnel. In addition, many ethnicities were specifically targeted, such as Asian peoples or the so-called Volga Germans. By 1938, when the purges ended, around 700,000 people had been killed. Hundreds of thousands more died in the gulags, to which they were forcibly transported. Although this indiscriminate killing had come to an end, arrests continued for decades. But this did not only affect those whom Stalin suspected. Their wives and children were also affected, simply by virtue of being relatives of the person in question. The Soviet Union even had an article in its penal code detailing what was to be done with family members of traitors to the motherland. At the beginning of the purges, the wives of those arrested were automatically imprisoned without even an investigation being carried out. Children were taken to orphanages, or if they proved too troublesome, were taken to forced labor camps or penal colonies. After 1938, only women who were deemed politically unreliable, socially dangerous, or who knew of their husband's activities became prisoners. This change in the NKVD's actions did not prevent thousands of them from being rounded up and taken to special gulags. These were often thousands of kilometers away from the cities where they lived, so they had to face a difficult journey to reach their destination.
Вот я помню, как я слизывала, ведь мороз был сильный.
I remember when there was a hard frost.
Гайки, болты, которые
Inside the wooden cattle truck, I used to lick the ice off the metal screws and bolts, fearing only that my tongue would stick.
Вот так мы
That's how we traveled,
ехали.
for about a month.
One of the best known of these camps was located in the city of Karaganda, in the Akmola province of Kazakhstan. It was part of KlLED, one of the largest gulag complexes in the entire Union, and was known as Alir. This was an acronym for its formal name in Russian: Akmola Labor Camp for Women of Traitors to the Motherland. It was put into operation in 1937, and by the time it was completed, it occupied around 30 hectares. The following year, female prisoners began to arrive, and despite its large size, the place was soon overwhelmed. Several women had to be taken to other camps in the surrounding area. The sentence for those held in Alir was generally between 5 and 10 years. During this time, they had to perform forced labor, such as building barracks to house the incessant number of new captives. To do this, they had to spend endless hours kneading mud to make bricks, while the clothes they wore did little to protect them from the weather. The hands of many were not accustomed to this type of work, as several had been teachers, scientists, musicians, or artists before being imprisoned. Escape was not an option. In addition to the watchtowers with armed guards, 2 barbed wire fences surrounded the grounds. It was without a doubt, as the detainees there said, a concentration camp.
During the first 2 years, the strict regime at the camp placed many limitations on the already marginalized women.
Every day at work, the women were escorted by a convoy with dogs and machine guns. Those women were really considered dangerous to the society to the extent that they had to be isolated from the rest of the people.
The oldest women, the sick, and the few children who were allowed to stay with their mothers were put to work in embroidery and sewing factories. The temperature in the area was a serious problem. In the summer, the heat was terrible, reaching 40 degrees. But on winter nights, frosts were frequent, bringing the thermometer down to 30 degrees below zero, or even lower. All year round, the powerful winds of the Soviet steppe whipped the faces of the prisoners. Communication with the outside world was strictly forbidden, as no letters could be written or received. Many had no way of knowing what had happened to the rest of their families. Many of these women had been separated from their children, who ended up in orphanages. And after the start of World War II and the German invasion in 1941, the need for information skyrocketed. While their older sons, brothers, uncles, and fathers were fighting on the Eastern Front, the women languished and continued to work. The only news they received came from the guards when they deigned to answer their questions. There were villages around Alir inhabited by locals, but contact with the prisoners was not allowed. Even many of the Kazakhs were removed from their lands when the detention camp began to expand. Some of the livestock raised by the Kazakhs was used to feed the inmates, although the vast majority of this food ended up in the guards' pots. The detainees' nutrition consisted mainly of potatoes and cabbage. On special occasions, they might receive a piece of bread. The poor diet, coupled with the brutal climate, forced labor and abuse by the guards, meant the deaths of many. On the other hand, the local inhabitants, in a show of humanity and bravery, sometimes helped the women with their food rations. Through the fences, they threw balls of kashk, a type of dried yogurt with ingredients that they could never dream of trying inside the gulag. Since the guards mistook these balls for stones, they did not intervene, thinking that the population was getting even with the traitors. They hid this food and ate it when no one was looking. The camp staff were particularly cruel to the female prisoners at Alir. As soon as they arrived, the women were taken to the baths to wash, under the gaze of armed men. Many spoke of the shame, fear, and anger they felt in these humiliating moments, while the guards mocked them with tasteless jokes. Sometimes they had to wait completely naked for their turn in the shower. To prevent the spread of lice, they were completely shaved. Not just their heads, but also their pubic hair. As female doctors were in short supply, this was usually done by a man, compounding the humiliation. Added to this were physical checkups, where security staff often took liberties with the excuse of searching for objects that might help them escape. No opportunity was missed to degrade the women, who we must remember were there only as relatives of those suspected of being traitors. The vast majority were completely innocent. Sadly, as in many such places, sexual abuse was also common. Thousands of women were raped by the guards, and many of them became pregnant as a result. There are records of around 1,500 births resulting from rape by Soviet officers.
Шул лагерде тутукланган канлар 5 yıl 6 yıl içinde mesela ne bileyim sizge yüzlerinin kichkene ballar doğan. Kaydan o ballar doğan? Yani bu kadınlar hepsileri anda zorlanganlar. Olar tecavüzga uğratılganlar. Ve o ballarının endi bir taqdirini bakın.
The constant danger of abuse forced some female prisoners to resort to desperate measures. If a man gave them some special attention, they could become his field wives. This guaranteed them protection from attacks by other people. In exchange for sexual relations, they were also often favored with larger food rations or lighter work. It should be noted that even in this brutal place, people were sometimes able to form emotional relationships. Alir was intended for women only, but this was just one of the camps that made up the KlLLED complex. Around it, other centers held male prisoners. Although contact between them was forbidden by the guards, people were occasionally able to engage in brief conversations through the barbed wire. Love letters were smuggled or thrown over the fences, waiting for a moment when the eyes of the security personnel were not on them. There are even records of unofficial marriages carried out behind the barrier. Although many of these relationships would not have a happy ending, they were moments of hope in a place totally devoid of it. These stories serve as a record of how these people maintained their humanity, even though their jailers tried in every way to eliminate it. Pregnancies, as mentioned above, were not an uncommon occurrence in these camps. If allowed to continue, women had the right to not work for a month before the birth and for a month after. But if the supervisors needed to meet the production quota of the camp, they could decide to perform an abortion. Of course, without consulting the opinion of the prisoner. These terminations were often carried out by very unskilled personnel, and several are known to have ended in the death of the patients. In other cases, the women themselves decided to stop the unwanted pregnancy, going so far as to stab their bellies with the needles they used for sewing. Such was the brutal desperation caused by carrying the child of their torturers. Sometimes, if the pregnancy was allowed by the authorities, the women could see an improvement in their treatment. The guards were forbidden from physically punishing them, the work was less hard, and during their last month, they were excused from duty entirely. In special cases, they were even released from the camp before serving their sentence. When the prisoners heard these rumors, a few of them actively sought to become pregnant. Others did so for different reasons. The hope of a child gave them something to strive for and brought them closer to the life they had had outside the gulags. According to one prisoner, it made them regain a sense of femininity and purpose in such a hostile environment. However, for those pregnancies that did go to term, the infant mortality rate was very high. The conditions in which these infants were born were extremely harsh and unhygienic. Almost no food was set aside for their feeding, and breast milk was poor in nutrients due to the malnutrition of the mothers. Breastfeeding was almost the only time women could see their children, since after a short leave, they had to return to work. If for some reason, whether it was work duties or the whims of the guards, the prisoners missed the time allotted to feed their children, there was no other opportunity to do so, and the infant would not eat that day. The slim chances of seeing these children grow up were not unique to Alir, of course. In all the female concentration camps scattered across the Union, prisoners had to face the harsh reality that their children were unlikely to survive.
Увезли в Бутырку в больницу, где я родила мальчика. 2 дня не несут кормить, 3-й день пошел. Охранник несет сверток и говорит: умер. Это мой ребенок умер.
On rare occasions, those born in Alir were allowed to remain there. The Gulag supervisors thought that after a few years, the children would be able to help their mothers with menial tasks. But usually, when they reached 2 years of age, they were cruelly separated from the women. This was usually done at night to take everyone by surprise and prevent the work from stopping. The infants were taken to orphanages or given to other families trusted by the NKVD. Their fate was never revealed to their mothers, so even if they were released, tracking down their child was a nearly impossible task. As we told you before, many saw these children as the only reason to continue enduring the brutal treatment of the camp. In this sense, when separated from their children, they sometimes threw themselves against the barbed fences, seeking to end their lives. The anguish of these women continued for decades. Female prisoners continued to be transported to Alir, and not even the end of World War II in 1945 meant that the truckloads of new captives stopped. Only in the early 1950s, when the Cold War brought international pressure on Soviet policies, did the camp begin to slow down. With the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, Alir was finally closed. Despite this, many of its prisoners were transferred to other camps, and only in 1958 were they allowed to return home. Nothing would be the same for these women. Many of their husbands, those designated as traitors to the homeland, had been killed or were missing. Some, the luckier ones, remained imprisoned in places as remote as Siberia and would have to wait years for their release. Apart from their partners, other members of their families had died fighting the Nazis. Their homes had been destroyed in bombings or appropriated. The country itself was going through one of its toughest times, and it took decades for them to recover economically from the damage caused by the war. The Soviet government, beyond freeing them, offered them no help at all. Many former prisoners ended up emigrating to other countries to rebuild their lives from scratch. It is believed that between its opening in 1938 and its closing in 1953, approximately 18,000 women passed through Algiers. Some were wives of men of great importance to Soviet politics and culture, such as Nikolai Bukharin and Boris Pilnyak. Even the mother of Maya Plisetskaya, one of the most important ballerinas of recent decades, passed through this terrible place. Today, on the land once occupied by Algiers, there is the Memorial Center for Victims of Political Repression and Totalitarianism. It was opened on May 31, 2007, on the day when in Kazakhstan, the hundreds of thousands of men and women persecuted by the iron hand of the Soviets are remembered. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what measures do you think the Soviet government should have taken to repair the traumas suffered by these women? You can leave your answer in the comments box. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history